2015 British election has thrown up a stunning result that confounded the opinion.
Newspapers have their ear to the ground.
Classic tabloid front page. They're doing what tabloids they're looking.
This general election has produced quite a remarkable story. A majority Conservative government.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're looking at this week. Britain elects a new government. For the country's right-wing press, it's job done. Another American goes to jail for leaking an intelligence story to the news media, in this case, the New York Times. Macedonia, the former Yugoslav republic, a surveillance scandal that has journalists up in arms and the government on the ropes. And career advice for young reporters doesn't get much more frank than this.
It's probably not going to happen.
Britain has just gone through an election which delivered a new conservative government. And to paraphrase in the loosest sense of the word, the American writer Mark Twain, reports of the demise of the British newspaper baron, the end of their influence, have proven to be premature. The press in the UK is owned in the main by a few wealthy moguls who lean to the political right, support big business, and usually the Conservative Party. Some of the names, like Murdoch, are well known, but there are others, Rothermere, Barclay, and more recently Lebedev, whose profiles aren't quite as high, but who are as familiar to the politicians running for office as those politicians are to British voters. Some, including the defeated, now former Labour Party leader, Ed Miliband, say that with print circulation in decline and the stench of the phone hacking scandal still lingering in the UK, that the press barons no longer have the clout that they once did. But is that really the case when their ability to shape the political discussion remains, and not just with their readers, but by often setting the news agenda in broadcast media, which is where most people get their news? Now, with the Conservatives in power for the next 5 years, the shape of British media could change significantly. The BBC, often accused by those on the right of having a left-wing bias, could face reforms. As for the regulation of the print side proposed by the Leveson inquiry that followed the hacking scandal, well, that idea seems to be going nowhere. Our starting point this week is London.
Newspapers in this country are proudly partisan, and that goes to their very core and identity.
Right-wing coverage gets purchase in an electoral cycle, and it would be reckless to think that Murdoch did not move floating voters in the last weeks of the campaign.
And they have taken their style from British politics, a style of attack dog journalism that got the popular papers into an awful lot of trouble.
In the UK, you don't own the Times for money. You own the Times because it gives you a seat at the table.
Says the Times.
The official election campaign ran for 5.5 weeks, during which the story never really came alive. It was a long, mostly turgid piece of political theater, with the parties sleepwalking, the polls said, into a second consecutive minority government. Then came the election night surprise.
It would be simplistic, of course, to say that it was the right-wing press that won it. But it is a very interesting feature of the last weeks of the campaign that you see this very close syncing of Conservative messaging with the newspapers.
Of a weak Ed Miliband government propped up by the SNP.
Propaganda by the parties, combined with a steady sort of drum roll of headlines and front pages.
The view of the Sun, which is of course owned by Rupert Murdoch, had a view about Ed Miliband, which was based around his prospective competence, and we articulated that relatively clearly. And it was a view in the end that seemed to be shared by the electorate.
People don't necessarily align their vote with the editorial personality or direction of the newspaper that they read. And I certainly don't think they slavishly follow its advice. What I think newspapers do, however, is set the tone and some of the direction of TV coverage.
Sometimes the way in which TV news takes its cues from print journalism is obvious. British broadcasters have a tradition of examining to the point of obsessing over what the papers say. BBC TV once had a show called exactly that. That program is now defunct, although BBC Radio still broadcasts a show with the same title, and the TV news channels routinely devote segments to the stories and opinions in the printed press. However, the real impact happens off-camera. Go into any TV newsroom in any country, and you'll find that newspapers are part of the furniture. Editors read them religiously. Consciously or subconsciously, their news judgment can be affected by the agenda of the printed press. Britain's pro-Labour dailies are outsold by papers on the political right by almost 5-1. And some, the Murdoch tabloids and the Daily Mail, edited by Paul Dacre, have an agenda with a capital A.
But I do think the press does set the agenda for the broadcasters. And it certainly comes down very hard on the broadcasters when they don't meet their agenda. So you definitely notice a kind of change in tone of the BBC. And they are following the way the print media describe things. So you'll listen to an interview on the Today programme.
You went ahead with that massive spending, you continue that massive spending.
Where everything is, you know, how are you going to pay for that? How are you going to clear the deficit? And those are the only criteria for kind of sensible policy making that the BBC will now admit. Now, that's the first time in my life I've heard the BBC only interested in those questions.
One of the perks of owning a newspaper is that you have a seat at the table in editorial decisions, particularly at the BBC. The newspapers are used, as it were, as a proxy for public opinion. And the thinking goes, if all these millions of people are buying this, in some way they must be speaking to a public opinion that's out there. The idea that the best way to take the temperature of the nation is through the filter of Paul Dacre's editorial decisions it seems to me is a lunatic proposition. And yet that's exactly where the BBC tends to look.
I think the influence of the printed press is diminishing simply because fewer people see it. It really is that simple. Okay, it sets some of the broadcasters' agenda, but don't forget that the really big dirty secret of printed newspapers is how old their readers are. Printed newspapers simply do not reach very many people under the age of 35.
Now, on to another story.
How influential are the papers when it comes to TV news in the UK? A study by Cardiff University looked at campaign coverage by broadcasters and concluded it reflected the right-wing press. Case in point, when a letter signed by 103 so-called business leaders backing the Conservatives was published in the Telegraph, 38% of TV election coverage that night was about the letter. When 140 health professionals wrote about the National Health Service backing the opposition Labour Party, TV news virtually ignored it. We found one report and a few articles online. Overall, the study said, the Conservatives' favoured campaign issues made up 43% of all TV election coverage, dwarfing the coverage of concerns of the left, issues like healthcare and housing. The study found the same coverage pattern across 5 different channels, yet it's the publicly owned BBC that the Conservative papers keep going after. And now that Prime Minister Cameron has a majority government, the BBC can expect efforts to reform it.
The principles of the BBC, i.e. something that we all fund together and operates as a public service for all of us, really run counter to the right-wing social ideal. So they are hostile to it in a way that the left can never be. What generally happens when the Conservatives want to break a public service is that there is a period of underfunding and internecine fighting until everybody agrees that the institution is broken.
The BBC is also arguably the largest newspaper in the country. It produces lots of written content, and that is in a direct competition to newspapers and magazines who are trying to make a living from selling a product based around news, sport and features. So there is an argument that the BBC is actually in direct competition with what should be a free commercial enterprise.
In the dying days of the election campaign, the since-departed opposition leader Ed Miliband said that Rupert Murdoch's power isn't what it once was, that the phone hacking scandal had diminished the media baron and his influence.
He's much less powerful than he used to be.
That may well be true, and perhaps Murdoch, the rest of the right-wing press, and their agenda-setting capabilities had nothing to do with the election result. But with the Conservatives now in power, a majority government in hand, and no coalition partners to slow them down or dilute their agenda, the British media space will be worth watching. On the download this week, our viewers on the coverage of the British election story.
I think that the conservative-leaning parts of the press, which are in the majority, were overall particularly brutal and personal at times in their attacks on Ed Miliband during the UK general election campaign. And I think that that probably was a factor in the result. It was Labour's worst result since 1987. And I think that if the Labour Party are searching for the reasons as to why the result was so definitively bad, it cannot solely look to the press coverage.
There was a lot of talk in the run-up to this election about sort of social media and digital media having a greater impact than the traditional press. That appears not to be the case. It'll be interesting to see in 5 years' time what happens when circulation has declined further and social media is even more influential on people's voting patterns.
Other media stories on our radar this week. A former CIA officer convicted of sharing classified information on Iran to a New York Times journalist has been jailed for 3.5 years. Jeffrey Sterling was sentenced after being found guilty of violating the Espionage Act for allegedly leaking details of a secret U.S. operation to disrupt Iran's nuclear program to Times reporter James Risen. Risen wrote about the plan in his book, State of War, and he was pressured by the Justice Department to confirm that Sterling was his source. Risen refused. Prosecutors wanted a longer sentence. They asked for up to 23 years, but Sterling's lawyers argued for leniency, citing the case of General David Petraeus as a legal precedent. Just last month, Petraeus was spared jail time after pleading guilty to sharing classified information with his biographer and one-time lover, Paula Broadwell. Mohammed Fahmy, one of 3 Al Jazeera journalists imprisoned in Egypt for more than a year, is now suing his employer. Lawyers for Fahmy, a Canadian citizen, filed a lawsuit in Vancouver on May 5th. He is seeking $100 million in compensation. Fahmy said, "The network acted negligently toward us before the arrest, but they also failed to reimburse me for my full legal fees." Fahmy, who was Al Jazeera's Cairo bureau chief, was arrested in December 2013, along with colleagues Peter Gresta and Bahar Mohammed. They were accused of spreading false news and collaborating with the ousted Muslim Brotherhood. Gresta has since been deported, while Fahmy and Mohammed are awaiting their retrials. The network has denied the allegations and said all governments have news outlets that they don't like, but they don't use spurious grounds to put journalists in jail. If Fahmy wants to seek monetary compensation from anyone, it should be from his jailers, referring to the Sisi government. In Bangladesh, yet another blogger has been murdered, the third such killing in just 3 months. On May 11th, Ananta Bijoy Das was hacked to death by a masked gang in the northeastern city of Sylhet. Authorities have yet to confirm the motive, but Das's colleagues say the 33-year-old had been threatened over his pro-secular blog posts. Religious groups in the country have been pushing for tougher anti-blasphemy laws to protect Islam against secular bloggers trying to keep religion out of politics. Das's writings were published on Mukto Mona, a website created by Avijit Roy, a U.S.-based atheist blogger who was murdered 3 months ago in Dhaka. Then blogger Washikur Rahman was killed in the same city for what his attackers called anti-Islamic writing. Sumit Galhotra from the U.S.-based Committee to Protect Journalists said the government of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina must take urgent steps to ensure the security of critical bloggers in Bangladesh, given this series of murders. Macedonia is a small country of just 2 million people, but the government there has a big media story on its hands. 3 months ago, the leader of the main opposition party accused the government in Skopje of an illegal surveillance program, the phone tapping of up to 20,000 people, including more than 100 journalists, over a 4-year period. The Prime Minister, Nikola Gruevski, has denied the allegations. He says the recordings are fabricated, even though some of his top ministers resigned just this past week, as well as his intelligence chief. Initially, the state-owned broadcaster MRT and a number of other media outlets took the government at its word, choosing not to air or publish the tapes until their authenticity was verified by the courts. The opposition says that MRT has turned into a mouthpiece for the government, refusing to have the opposition leader Zoran Zaev on its air, a claim which MRT denies. All of this is happening as Macedonia seeks to join the European Union, and EU officials in Brussels are watching the developments closely. The Listening Post's Flo Phillips now on what the opposition in Skopje is calling the truth about Macedonia.
Лидери опозита Zoran Zaev са СДСМ ја објави четвртата политичка бомба.
They've become known as political bombs.
Имаме аудиоматеријали кои разобличуваат директната спрега. Премиер, УБК, медиуми.
A series of allegedly wiretapped conversations suggesting the Macedonian Prime Minister, Nikola Gruevski, and his government have been conspiring to, among other things, rig media coverage. The mass surveillance program exposed by the opposition leader Zoran Zaev back in February, allegedly targeting thousands of citizens and scores of journalists, is a big story. But it took the resignation of government ministers this past week for the state-owned broadcaster to address the story head-on.
Što drugo stoješe во писмените оставки?
Frapantno je.
Amazingly, neither the leader of the opposition nor anyone else from the party has been invited by the public broadcaster on any political show in the last 3 months. The public broadcaster has a legal obligation to report on every development in the country, but as the editor-in-chief of Macedonian radio and television has said, they are refusing to report on this scandal in any of their news programs. Shame on them.
I sincerely regret that one of the biggest scandals in Macedonia's recent history has been revealed by a political party. It's a bit strange. If you ask me, in any normal situation, this would have been a subject for investigative journalism.
In several of the published recordings, the Opposition Social Democratic Union, or SDSM, says the voices you hear are government officials talking to compliant editors and producers at some of the major TV channels. It's an a la carte menu. They order up the stories they like, and they send back the ones they don't.
The best illustration of the whole story in Macedonia is the recording where we hear the editor-in-chief of TV Citl and the culture minister in conversation. The editor-in-chief is heard saying that 7 of 12 reports that day have been pre-ordered, and he trashes his own news program.
Идеја ти кажам, значи не претерујте зашто има од кај твојот премиер толку многу порачки и што вестите на сите од секундон.
This is a very explicit example of the media providing favorable coverage in return for government kickbacks.
Во друг разговор, шефот на тајната полиција
In another conversation, the director of the Secret Service instructs the news editor on how to cover the ruling party, demanding he move the timing of the evening news bulletin to a better slot.
И нешто посебно од Сител, кој што има едни вести, да врши некоја работа. Барем овие 2 недели требаше ги врати вестите у 9.
This is nothing other than directly editing the news program. In fact, the director of the Secret Service has basically become the editor-in-chief. I am convinced that other editors work in the same way. The media is turning into nothing more than propaganda.
We contacted the state-owned broadcaster MRT over the opposition's allegations that not a single member of the party had been invited on the channel in the last 3 months. The MRT board sent us a statement which said, "We reject all accusations directed at MRT over the absence of SDSM officials. We are facing a boycott from the opposition, and the most striking example is an invitation we extended to Zoran Zaev 10 days ago, which he rejected." We followed up and asked if there were any other invitations over the previous 2.5 months since the surveillance scandal broke. The MRT official told our producer he couldn't remember, and our attempt to get a clear answer from anyone else at the channel proved futile. So draw your own conclusions. Macedonia is a polarised country, with each side pointing the finger. And the government has its supporters, some of whom are in the media.
I believe we are facing a situation where the leader of the opposition, Zoran Zaev, has faked the material. We have no proof that the tapes are authentic. So now, when we have this series of crimes, do you really expect the media to get involved in covering the release of these audios?
Given the fact that no one has contested these recordings, I'm assuming they are true. Just a few days ago, the leader of the opposition revealed a list of journalists whose phones have been wiretapped, and my name was near the top. These journalists were tapped because they have critical views. Someone does not like them, and that's why we're being targeted.
Tomislav Keziorowski has had a rough couple of years. He's just been released from prison after a controversial sentence was overturned to find he's once again top of the government's watchdog list. Borjan Jovanovski, an independent journalist for Nova TV, discovered he was also a target, but he wasn't just being tapped. Last month, he says a death threat in the form of a funeral wreath was delivered to his door, sparking fellow journalists to hold their own vigil in sympathy.
Where this death threat comes from, I cannot say. The pro-government media has employed hate speech, very much supported by the government.
објавив листа и next year ќе објавам листа за сите тие што сметам дека треба дебело под бетонска плоча да бидат зацементирани.
And I can say for sure that this threat is an example of that.
Macedonia's ranking in the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index has fallen 83 places in just 6 years. Constant pressure on voices critical of the government is one factor, but the closure of the biggest independent TV channel, A1, is another. In 2011, Special Forces shut down the station after its owner was indicted for tax avoidance. But its supporters believe the tax issue only materialized when the channel got tough on the government. Independent voices in the media are now fewer, but supporters of the government play the numbers game.
Macedonia is a leader when it comes to media throughout Europe, in every respect. We have 123 registered TV stations, an absolute record per capita in Europe. We have 6 national channels, each with their own unbiased editorial policies. Crucially, this means that important information cannot be buried.
We have an absurd situation. 180 broadcast outlets, but all of these media are weak and unprofessional. The government frequently stresses the numbers, but they forget to say they all have an identical output. Macedonians do not get balanced information about the society, so it is hardly surprising that we are in such a deep political crisis. The media are not part of the solution. They are part of the problem.
With each day that passes, the political crisis in Macedonia deepens. The Prime Minister is looking increasingly isolated. It may not be long before all media are covering his story.
Finally, if you're currently studying journalism, firing off application letters, trying to make your way in an industry whose economic model has been demolished by the digital earthquake, and you need a pep talk, you'll have to look elsewhere. In fact, you may want to look away from the screen now. A few months back, a British financial journalist named Felix Salmon, who's based in New York, served up some career advice to those who still aspire to be ink-stained wretches. The long and the short of it is, don't bother, it's just not worth it. His letter made the rounds on the web and created a bit of a debate. It was a healthy exercise. But like most journalistic endeavors these days, nobody got paid, and that's the problem. We got Mr. Salmon to sit in front of our camera to deliver the bad news with a personal touch. And we'll see you next time here at the Listening Post.
Dear budding journalist, thanks. Thank you for your email. I'm super flattered by the lovely things you said about me and how you'd love to have a career in journalism and how you'd love to do the kind of thing that I do. But you won't. Today is a wonderful time for journalism. I'm a golden ager. I'm constantly astonished by the quantity and the quality of the material being produced in some of the most improbable places. But that does not mean that life is good for journalists. In fact, life is not good for journalists. People have told you this already, but take it from me too, journalism is a dumb career move. First, there's like an explosion in the number of talented people writing online. It's supply and demand. As the supply of those people have risen, their price has fallen. And then you have this platform revolution. Everybody's a platform these days. And what you have when you're running a platform is value which lies not in journalists, not in human talent, but rather in this confluence of product and brand and technology. The journalists, the workers, the labor is easily replaceable. Still, you want to be a journalist and you want my advice. Number one, get deep subject matter expertise. Number two, get skills which you can get better at over time, like illustration or audio editing, not just reporting and writing. Everyone can do that. That's table stakes. Number three, do you need luck and privilege? I'm super privileged. It really helped me to be white and well-educated and have this English accent which makes me sound more intelligent than I am. If you care about great journalism, then go. Find those great stories. Tell those great stories. If what you want is a career where you can bring up children, where you can make more and more money as the decades pass, I don't really know what to tell you. Except, I'm sorry, but it's probably not going to happen.